So, my only published book to date has the word Genesis in its title, which is rather appropriate, because it is the birthplace of the modern destroyer. Up to that point, destroyers had been slowly growing to what they've become, but they hadn't reached it, and those are the first three designs which really are pure, and I say this, pure general-purpose destroyers. Always an interesting thing to discuss, that one. Well, the Sopwith Cuckoo. That's Exodus of Naval Aviation. Let me explain. Okay. Genesis is probably what we're dealing with when we've got the seaplane tenders and the float plane vessels. You know, aircraft being flown at sea, sort of being developed. It's sort of showing its possibility. It's not quite there. Kind of like Genesis is building of the world. But it's not what the world will become, it's what the world's starting as. It's the building blocks being laid down. Well, Exodus really is about how the world moves forward. How the world grows from there. It's not what the world's going to become. It's not what the world has become. But it shows the growth. Sopwith Cuckoo is this, because it is the first, I would argue, not just the first carrier-created torpedo bomber, but I would argue it's the first purpose-built carrier aircraft. Hold with me now, because there are many people who don't go, but there's this. If you look at all of them, they're all either rebadged types of variants of land-based aircraft, or they're not even that. They are land-based aircraft. Which was fine, because let's be honest, most of the airfields at this time were sufficiently, how do I put this, grassy and rocky, that landing on an airfield versus landing on a carrier at this time is probably not that much different, and there aren't that many DAC carriers to go around, so justifying it is interesting. But the Cuckoo isn't. The Cuckoo is the first aircraft which is naval specification, naval procurement. I know it's taken over by the Royal Air Force, but by the time they take it over, the RNAS has already brought it into service. So, if we consider its first flight is June 1917, it entered service in 1918. It has been ordered into production in February 1918, and its first one is delivered in May 1918. The Royal Air Force doesn't exist till April 1918. It's kind of difficult to claim it's a Royal Air Force aircraft. They do operate it. They are the ones who operate it, so that's correct. But in terms of development, it's entirely naval procurement. And the whole way through, it's what is the Navy looking for? What do the Navy want? The answer to that question, of course, is what the Navy wants is something to make the German desire to hide in Wilhelmshaven extinct. They want to make it so that even if the Germans decide to not come out if they attack them, they will view their time of having ships to be limited. They would like them to make them move. Either come out of Wilhelmshaven and attack them, or make them move further into the Baltic. Make them move away from the North Sea, away from where perfidious Albion can reach them. That is the Royal Navy's plan. And there are a lot of people behind this plan. There are a lot of people pushing this idea. I know there are many who claim to be, the righteous parent of naval aviation and the concept of strike, and most of those people occur in World War II and go, yes, it was us! But I'm going to say something which I've never thought I would say in the world. But honestly, Admiral Beatty has more of a claim to that than they do. And all he did was literally rubber stamp plans. Because the plans were being conceived in 1918. The idea was to launch strikes with, well, actually, 1917, they're planning strikes for 1918. The idea was 100 cuckoos, 120 cuckoos to be used as a strike. Now, let's think about that. Yes, they didn't yet have the systems for launching torpedoes as the Swordfish would have, so they didn't have the tension wire, they didn't have the fins, none of those things. But 120 torpedo bombers launching their torpedoes with pretty much minimal opposition. Now, you might say that they have a 25% chance of those torpedoes not hitting the bottom in Wilhelmshaven, considering how shallow and muddy it is, and actually managing to go to their targets. Okay, but 25% of 120 is still 30 torpedoes. And 30 torpedoes inside Wilhelmshaven, that's an interesting space to have 30 torpedoes. I mean, there is a chance that none of them hit anything. But I wouldn't like to put money on it. And the thing is, let's say the British lose 12 aircraft. Let's say they lose 12 aircraft, okay? Let's say they lose 10% of the force. Or even 20% of the force. Let's go for 20% of the force. Let's be really generous and go 20% of the force. Well, think about that. Which is easier? For the Royal Navy to replace 24 pilots and Sopwith Cuckoos, or for the Germans to replace a dreadnought? Wars are logistics and infrastructure. Yes, there's a lot of strategy in them, but mostly it's about maximizing your opponent's losses in a decisive way and minimizing your own, so that you can recover forces faster and therefore supply more to your leaders to do their jobs and accomplish their missions than your opponent can. It's a reality. And a Sopwith Cuckoo is built entirely for this reality. In fact, when you look at it and you look at this scenario, first thing you realize is that, ooh, this is a single-seat aircraft. It's a single-seat aircraft. Not only that, they literally work through the various types of engines available and decide that the engine they wanted to use is too important to be used because it's useful for a fighter. They want to use something which is not as important. That matters. It matters to them. I don't want this to come across as the idea that these aircraft were designed to be expendable. They're not. But they are designed to be expended. The thing is, they would prefer not to lose any aircraft. They prefer not to lose any pilots. They prefer to launch an absolutely successful operation and not lose anything. But the calculation behind the Sopwith Cuckoo is that there is an acceptable level they are prepared to lose for the gains they're likely to make. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's all 120 of the second plan. But considering their production run, considering the number of aircraft they were capable and quickly churned out, and capable of producing and quickly churned out, and the number of aircrew they required, and the amount of training they were going to put into them, it's, I would say, acceptable losses could have run to 50%. as long as they sink a dreadnought. And again, a sudden strike in harbour, especially considering German ships are far more subdivided than the British ships. So they're far more confined spaces, not as good for long-range cruising and missions to hot climates and distant places, but also it means when you're in harbour, you tend to have even more of your doors open up, etc., to allow things to move through, people to circulate, etc., space for people to move. And you might have a lot of crew off the ship as well, so it's going to slow down maybe your closing of doors. Yes, you can recover ships which are sunk in harbour. That is a lot easier. And ships sunk in the middle of the sea. But then you have to rebuild them, as the Americans will show you after Pearl Harbor. And the Americans do a very good job because they're prepared to put the resources in. So the Germans have the resources available. The reality is, they don't. And this is the context of the Sopwith Cuckoo. Now again, please note, if I'm drinking more than normal, occasionally the video seems juddery, I'm trying to stop it when I start sneezing and coughing. I am slightly better today, but I'm still getting better, so I apologise in advance if I'm drinking more, because the coughing has, unsurprisingly, given me a bit of a sore throat. And, well, the sneezing and coughing I try and keep off camera, so I have the pause button sitting underneath the mouse cursor, and I will just click quickly. Hopefully that works. Troubles, Battles and Airings, the genesis of the modern destroyer. Now, getting back to the fact I've called this one Exodus, one of the interesting questions I often get about a lot of things to do with ships and history is whether or not I believe ships have spirits. And I tend to answer it when I'm discussing it. My answer comes back to, there are buildings you walk into and they feel like they have an atmosphere. You will say it's a happy building, or it's a sad building, or this is not a good space. You pick up on the emotions of the people in that building. Okay. Well, that's kind of concentrated, because most of those places we're walking into are places of work, or places of worship, or places of trade and commerce. So you pick up. If it's a commercial space and it has a lively, engaging, energetic atmosphere, that feels good, and you're more likely to spend money in it. Well, that's why they want to keep the people happy in it, because happy people spend money more than sad people. Unless you're really sad, and then you spend money to try and make yourself happy. But that's another reason why they try and keep the atmosphere happy. So really sad people come there and spend a lot of money. When you're dealing with a ship, it's a kind of a fusion, because it's a place of work, it's a home, it's a safety net for fighting the biggest threat to any sailor known to mankind, the sea itself. The ocean is always out to kill you, and always has the weapons to do so. And it's also your steed for going into war. The scenario and situation which brings out both the best and worst of humanity's predilections, often simultaneously. I can't see how such things cannot get something. Maybe a spirit is a wrong word for it, but I can't think of a word which is more apt to explain it. We joke on this channel occasionally in lives about warspites, machine spirit, etc., taking our cue from Warhammer 40k. But realistically, you look at the ships named Warspite throughout history and the things they've got up to, and yeah, every time there's been some random occurrences, ships firing before everyone, even their captains, give the order, yeah, that was a warspite at the enemy, doing donuts on D-Day, which buys time. If you think about it, While Warspite is doing her donuts, what is the rest of the Grand Fleet doing? They're forming up. It means that in the nicest way, the High Seas Fleet, while they're dealing with trying to get past Warspite and distracted by Warspite, aren't able to deal with what the Grand Fleet are doing. And, well, her fault then clears up. Almost with no human intervention. It happened. It's fixed. They're not even sure, the people involved are not even sure if they fixed it. They're worried about it the whole way through the battle happening again. It doesn't happen again. They go in and get it checked after battle. They're not sure what caused it. They think they have an idea, but not 100% sure. You read the constructor's notes, and the constructors are basically going, yeah, we have a theory. We're going to treat it like that, because we can't disprove it, but we also can't prove it. So, I think when you have generations of crews entrusting to that name something, believing in something, I think that can build up. I don't know how else to explain it other than a spirit. I really don't. Cosmic energy sounds a bit weird and cultish for me. Generations of crew believing, dedicating their lives and believing in that ship, that name. Has an impact. But yeah. But also there's the reason I tend to refer to biblical terms is when I was 7 at school, a teacher said I couldn't have got, that the reading age I'd got must be incorrect because my reading age was so much higher than my actual age. So I went home and read the entire Bible. They were a religious studies teacher. Came back in next week and answered questions on the entire thing. Prove my point. So, origins. First flight, as mentioned, June 1917. Introduced 1918. So, it starts off, and it's actually quite a rapid procurement, because Commodore Murray Sutter, who was the superintendent of the Air Department, in charge of aircraft construction, went to Sopwith in October 1916. So think about that for a procurement scenario. Goes in October 1916 and goes, I'd like a single-seat aircraft, capable of carrying a 1,000-pound torpedo, and sufficient fuel to provide endurance of 4 hours. And surprisingly, what comes about is a rather large aircraft. In fact, it's termed as a free-bay biplane. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I know the moment I said those words out, I'm going to have to explain bays. So, basically, every set of struts you have, it's called a bay. So if you only have one strut on each wing and one set of struts, it's called a single bay biplane. If you have two, you're a two-bay biplane. If you have 3 sets of struts, you're a 3-bay biplane. Okay. The larger aircraft tend to have more bays because they tend to have more wings, in larger wings. Sometimes I'm trying not to cough when I'm going for the thing and I say the wrong word, so I apologise on that one. And pretty much this is the whole thing about the Cuckoo. It is, again, rather like with the Swordfish and aircraft which are going to come between the Cuckoo and Swordfish, which is one of the longest running programs of torpedo bomber evolution. and please note I'm using the word evolution here. Okay? One of the things that comes about when you start looking at Royal Navy aircraft carrier and aircraft design in the 1920s and 30s in terms of developing their torpedo bombers, they're not looking for revolution. They're looking for evolution. They're looking for every level for their capabilities to be better than they were before, but they want to keep what they already have. And they want long range, endurance, torpedo strike. They want the ability to hit their targets at night. One of the interesting things about the Cuckoo is the only reason that they take out the night flying capacity and the ability to attack their targets at night was they didn't think they could operate off the carriers at night at this point. But the fact it was part of the discussion, the idea of could we do these strikes at night, could we develop this to do this strike at night, is pretty darn interesting. Because if you think about it, the Royal Navy had continued on with that development for it and actually managed to push that through. Let's say they started this instead of October 1916, had started it a few months earlier, which when they'd first been considering it, but then other issues had come up, i.e. the various battles, which included Jutland, had come up. If they'd considered it then, pushed forward then, a few months earlier, there is the potential. If you consider it's October 1916 to June 1917, first flight, and production orders are issued in July 19. It's trials July 1917, and it's just August 1917 when they do their production orders. But it's just August. I mean, it might as well be July. If you push that back 4 months, 5 months, things get very interesting. Because when they're taking delivery from Blackburn, please notice, Sopwith design the aircraft, develop the aircraft, it's Blackburn who build it. One of the things that's often forgotten about Blackburn is they build a lot of aircraft for other manufacturers. They are a very good aircraft builder and a very experienced aircraft manufacturer. They deliver it, the first one, in May 1918. You shift that back 4 months. Well, that's January 1918. Could have been the swan song of the Royal Naval Air Service, would have been a nice big strike on Wilhelmshaven in January 1918. Or more likely March 1918. Quite possible. Quite doable. Could have changed a lot of history, and that will probably be actually today's question. What happens if the strike of 120 Cuckoos goes ahead in March 1918? Does the Fleet Air Arm get divided off from the Royal Navy again, or do the Royal Navy insist on retaining control of it? What do the Royal Navy make decisions with their aircraft carriers? And the really bonus question is, what happens if the Royal Navy go ahead and actually do a night strike in March 1918? Because think about that on the German ships in Wilhelmshaven. Because let's be honest, there's no light discipline going on in Wilhelmshaven at this point. At night, there's no need to. Who's going to come and attack them? Who's going to be stupid enough to be flying at night to come and attack them? No coughing. But the really cool thing, and I will say this, if you're wondering where the pictures come from, that really do nicely illustrate these this aircraft. They shamelessly come from the BAE Systems Heritage website, which covers all their aircraft. I have shamelessly borrowed them from there, and I am there's gonna be a reference to them down below, link to the page, so people know where I got them from. But I hoped BAE Systems wouldn't mind me using them for education purposes. I think their website, from my reading of it, says I'm allowed to use them if I'm using them for educational purposes. So fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. They don't mind me using it for education purposes. Link will be down below, I said. Anyway, so let's consider the specs of the production model. And yes, that's dropping a torpedo. I got another picture of that from later in the drop, which shows some of the issues of torpedoes which do not have tension wires and extra wooden fins attached. Anyway, so the length is 28 feet 6 inches. That's an interesting length. It's a good sized aircraft for World War One. But it's also interesting from another perspective, in that if we consider the Fairey Swordfish, not an unknown aircraft in terms of its capabilities, that's 35 foot 8 inches. So it's 8.69 meters versus 10.87 meters. A little bit longer on the Swordfish's side. Wingspan for the Cuckoo, 46 foot 9 inches, 14.25 meters. The wingspan of the Fairey Swordfish is actually shorter, 45 foot 6 inches, or 13.87 meters. The height, 10 foot 8 inches, or 3.25 meters. The height of the Swordfish, 12 foot 4 inches, 3.76 meters. Wing area is another interesting one. For the Cuckoo, it's 566 square feet, or 52.6 meters squared. For the Swordfish, it's 607 square feet, or 56.4 meters squared. Empty weight of a Cuckoo, 2,199 pounds, or just 3 kilograms under a ton. The empty weight for a Swordfish, well, that's 4,195 pounds, or 1,903 kilograms, or 1.9 tons. However you want to analyze it. The gross weight, which is their weight when they sort of are launching fully loaded, 3,883 pounds. Again, roughly 1,761 kilograms. That's 1 3/4 tons, roughly, a little bit more, but pretty much 1 3/4 tons. The gross weight for a Swordfish, 7,580 pounds, or 3,438 kilograms, or pretty much 3.4 tons. The Cuckoo, Sunbeam Arab, water-cooled piston engine, generating 200 horsepower, driving a 2-bladed fixed-pitch propeller. The Swordfish, Bristol Pegasus, 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine with 690 horsepower, so very nearly 3.5 times as much, driving a 3-bladed metal fixed-pitch propeller into the Mark I Swordfish. Top speed for the Cuckoo, 105.5 miles per hour. Maximum speed for the Swordfish, 143 miles per hour with the torpedo. Range for the Cuckoo, 335 miles. For the Swordfish, 522 miles. Endurance for the Cuckoo, 4 hours and about 10 minutes. For the Swordfish, 5 hours and 30 minutes. Service ceiling for the Cuckoo, 12,000 feet. 12,100 feet if we're being technical, but 12,000 feet is the practical one. For the Swordfish, service ceiling, 16,500 feet at full weight, i.e. when they're displacing the full weight of carrying the torpedo. Armament for the Cuckoo, a single 18-inch Mark IX torpedo. For the Swordfish, Well, she also had machine guns and, of course, a couple of extra crew if she really wanted to. Or, again, she was carrying a torpedo. Why was I doing that comparison versus the Swordfish, and why wasn't I putting the Swordfish stats up visibly? Well, there's two reasons. One, Swordfish is going to be done later in this series, and I don't want to give some of those slides away yet, because I haven't yet finished polishing them. And two, because the next time someone, and this is one of the reasons I'm doing this video quite so early on in the series, next time someone turns around to me and goes, well, the Swordfish is a World War I design, this is the actual World War I design. Okay? This is the actual World War I design. And it's a good aircraft for World War I. It ain't no Swordfish. It is not a Swordfish. I'm not saying a Swordfish would run rings around it, but I could use Swordfish as a combat air patrol to fight them off. Well, the Swordfish were carrying a torpedo. Let alone if you took the torpedo off the Swordfish and gave them rockets instead. It's an easy get-out clause, just looking at the biplane construction going, that means it's World War I because it's got a biplane. No, it isn't. It doesn't. If aerodynamics was that simple, that easy, you wouldn't require engineers to study how hard they have to do in order to become aero engineers. There are reasons you go for a biplane design, and with a torpedo bomber, even in the mid to late 1930s, a lot of powers, a lot more powers than just Britain, are using biplanes, and are considering biplanes for the next designs. Because it makes sense when you're carrying a load. It makes sense. So, service. Well, sadly enough for the Cuckoo, as quickly as they could be got in service, 90 had actually been delivered by the time of armistice. 232 were completed by the end of production in 1919. Blackburn produced 162 aircraft. Fairfield Engineering added another 50. Peagle and Company another 20. And the aircraft were mostly delivered directly to the storage depots which were established for aircraft at Renfrew and Newcastle. Yes, this was a time when the British government were actually storing aircraft. Storing aircraft for use. Good aircraft. They underwent trials, East Fortune, and then were sent to the Torpedo Aeroplane School. And by August 1918, training was taking place in the Firth of Forth, and they were practicing launching their torpedoes at moving targets, targets being towed by destroyers. So, these aircraft were designed to attack ships which were going to be in harbour. That's what they've been first been developed as, because that was a nice easy thing. But they were going, right then, we have tried this, we now need to codify this. And this is where these start. They start showing the capabilities. Yes, you can attack moving targets. They're being towed by destroyers. They're embarked aboard HMS Argus in November 1918. As I said, hostilities ended before they could conduct any combat operations. They have strong airframes, and when they did have to make water landings, they were safe. The pilots liked them. It was easy to control, and this is a standing thing that the British start off with going, hang on, if we make the plane easy to control and easy to fly, it makes our pilots' jobs easier. It allows them to fly in more adverse conditions. It's a useful trait to have. They didn't like the Arab engine, though. It was interesting. And eventually, some Cuckoo ones were converted to Cuckoo Mark IIs, which were powered by Woolsey Viper engines. Now, these engines are kind of interesting because they're again 200 horsepower engines, like the Sunbeam Arab, but they're a more reliable engine. The last unit to use the aircraft, number 210 Squadron, disbanded in April 1923, when the Cuckoo was replaced in service by the Blackburn Dart. Which of course had Blackburn, of course, being the company which, as I mentioned earlier, manufactured most of the Cuckoos. Sopwith, by this point, had gone through, as a company, all their issues and flirtations with motorbikes, and I'm not going to get into too much detail, but they end up turning into Hawker. So Hawker Aircraft and Hawker Siddeley are the successors to Sopwith. So if we're thinking about where does the Sopwith Camel, etc., where does it go? Where does Sopwith go as a company? Hurricane, Typhoon, Tempest, Sea Fury, Hunter, Harrier, Hawker Aircraft, Hawker Aviation, Sopwith. Just thought you'd like that little bonus, some nugget information. So, let's consider for summary the plan. The plan was rather an interesting one, what they were going to use these aircraft for. The idea was, at various points, when they were talking about 100 Cuckoos, was to use Argus, Furious, and Campania, along with Courageous and Glorious also carrying some, but still in their semi-cruiser form, not in their carrier form. And the plan was to launch 100 from the North Sea. By September 1917, Beatty was proposing a plan which involved 120 Cuckoos launching from 8 converted merchant vessels, to converted along the lines of Argus. This is another reason why, when people turn around to me and go, well, you know, the idea of converting merchant ships to aircraft carriers, that is World War II emergency design. That's pure about, you know, dealing with the submarine threat in World War II. I tend to look at them and go, you have a knowledge of history, but you haven't done enough reading yet. Yeah. The thing is, many of the ideas which come to fruition in World War II, which are developed and evolve and turn up in World War II as these world-changing ideas when they are finally delivered, actually have origins back in World War I. And many of the ideas in World War I which are world-changing had their origins back in earlier wars. Why? Because it takes time to develop things to the ability that they can actually deliver on the idea. We still haven't got to the time where aircraft can drop 100 tons of bombs from a single aircraft. They don't need to. They can drop a nuclear bomb, which is the same as dropping 100 tons of bombs, or rather 1,000 tons, or thousands of tons of bombs. Which is a problem. But it's a reality. And if you want to, by the way, go see, there are no Cuckoo airframes surviving intact anywhere, apparently. But, and I seem to remember seeing them, but a long time ago I think I visited there. If you go to the National Museum of Flight in Scotland, you'll find some Mark 1 wings. That's quite nice to go. The operators of the Cuckoo, and the people who shared the ideas of how to use it, well, not just the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. 6 Mark II aircraft, those ones with the Woolsey Viper engine, were operated by the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service. Sorry about the pause, it stopped the coughing coming through. Why? Because Japan was interested in them from the very beginning. From the very beginning of development of the Cuckoo, the Japanese were looking into it. When Murray Sutter is looking at what the Royal Navy, what they need to develop, what they want for this aircraft, The Japanese embassy, the naval attaché, is already trying to poke around with Sopwith, is already trying to find out details. They want to be involved from the get-go. They want to order them. They want to have them. They want the capability. None of the... Well, Campania and Argus would have been in pretty much those forms. Furious would have been in one of her earlier forms, but frankly I find her earlier forms slightly scary, so I went with a later form of a picture for her. The strike, what would it have done? Well, let's think about this. If the 100 aircraft one had been used as a model, and the plan had been delivered in late 1917. Think about that. Late 1917, 100 Sopwith Cuckoos descend on Wilhelmshaven. What did the Kaisermarine do? What did they do? Did they come out and fight? Well, look what happens in 1918 when they're ordered to guard, and that's they're worried about going to their certain death. There's a mutiny. If you've just had those crews just being attacked from above by weapons they couldn't really fight, or even worse if it's nighttime action, and they've lost. Doesn't matter if they've lost any ships which are sitting on the bottom. Doesn't matter if they've lost, they've been sunk. That's going to erode morale even more. If it's later in 1917, if it's December 1917 and the strike's launched, well, the German High Seas Fleet is a big bargaining chip. It's a bargaining chip that the German politicians hoped would allow them to secure some measure of leniency in the various negotiations. That safety, if that's been undermined, it's the thing which allows them to prevent really focused amphibious operations going around and attacking around the trench lines, because if the Allies do that, then the Grand Fleet will have to come cover it, and the destroyers will have to protect both them and the amphibious ships from submarines, as well as because if the High Seas Fleet comes out, then the amphibious ships will get swept aside, and the escort force, which is protecting from submarines, will get swept aside. So you need the Grand Fleet out, and that's going to divide your escorts, which means you won't have enough escorts to do it. Da-da-da-da-da. So long as the High Seas Fleet is in the North Sea, is this side of the Kiel Canal, it's a threat. It's a threat. The moment it's the other side of the Kiel Canal, to withdraw it, you can start doing things. You can start doing a lot of things. So, you launch these attacks at any point, you present the Germans with a massive dilemma. A massive dilemma. I don't think it's going to be a war-winning weapon. I don't see them turning up 100 of them, flying over Wilhelmshaven and sinking all the ships in Wilhelmshaven. The torpedoes aren't going to work that well. Some of them are going to break up when they hit the water. Some of them, because they're not going to be dropping them too high. Some of them are quite a lot of them are probably going to hit the bottom of the bottom of the bed, the harbour. Well, honestly, the harbour floor. They're just going to go into the mud. They're going to go into the rocks down there. And the reason I say that is, look at this picture. Look at the angle the torpedo's already at. It's not flat, is it? It's already starting to drop down. It's already starting to dive. It's already starting to go... Interesting. And that is ultimately the problem. Those torpedoes are going to behave in an interesting manner. They are not going to be necessarily be reliable. But again, if you're launching 100 and you've got a 5% or a 10% chance of those torpedoes working, that's still enough torpedoes in the water that it's going to create damage. And the fact is, you've launched a strike. The Germans are going to presume you're going to learn from the strike and come back and attack more, even if you don't hit the targets. So no matter what happens, they have to withdraw. They have to get their ships. They either have to use them, or they have to risk them being attrited in harbour. And honestly, that's going to have an impact. So, I promised a good set of pictures which would show what happens when the torpedoes are hitting the sea. And this is the aircraft, the Short Admiralty Type 184. First flight 1915, introduced 1915, retired 1933 with Estonia. It's a really interesting aircraft. It's probably the first I would call a proper torpedo bomber, in that it's pretty much designed from the get-go to carry and launch torpedoes, not interestingly adapted. And as you can see, the torpedo it's dropped, if you look at very carefully at the water, it looks like it's skipping along. That's a torpedo which can break up, because they can sort of survive one impact with the water, but a second or third, that's going to be a problem. And sometimes, of course, they go in tail first because they're engine heavy. Especially practice torpedoes and test torpedoes would be engine heavy because they wouldn't have explosive. So they'd have empty space. Some of the first ones, because they decided to make them of wood because, you know, that was cheaper. Trouble is, it also is a lot less dense and not as heavy as the motorized part at the end, and oh my, does that lead to fun. Development of naval aviation in World War I is on the edge of some really interesting things. I would say, though, as the Sopwith Cuckoo, to my mind, most beautifully illustrates, especially when compared with the Swordfish in 1939, as much as it may have a huge amount of potential, it's nowhere there yet. I've done videos recently on the capital ships of various navies at the beginning of World War II. And various people have put in some very witty comments on the lines of it would be better to have aircraft carriers entirely than battleships. And I can see their arguments. Most of those arguments really come true in the latter part of World War II. In 1939, even the most pro-aircraft carrier admiral would not have sat there and said, I don't want any battleships. The British were looking at fast capital ship task forces, combining the two. Why? Because the carrier has the reach and the potential, the capital ship has the guaranteed capability. You're in a period of transition. One is a known quantity that you know can do the job. The other is a potential quantity that can potentially do the job, but you haven't proven it yet. And if we look at how carriers and etc. perform in 39, in 40, and most of 41 before anyone else gets involved, they are developing. And then if we look at them in 41 and 42, rest of 41, 42, etc., they're still developing. There are times when things go wrong. There are times when they go very right. And there are all the times in between. And always beware of the confirmation bias, because when people are constructing a cultural memory, they often focus on the big events, and the vast majority of events get forgotten. I got into a bit of trouble talking about this recently, because I was talking about it in relation to convoys. We remember convoy PQ-17. We don't remember the dozen or so other convoys which got through with no trouble. We remember a lot of convoys which have problems, and there have been a few people responsible going, well, it's statistics, and you start to get into it. Yes, there are some stats about it, but also once you look into the actual losses, there are some convoys which suffer horrendous losses. Horrendous losses. Because they get caught by a wolf pack. But a large number of convoys which didn't get caught by anything until they got within range of the UK, and then got caught by German aircraft, didn't. Was that luck? Yes. But it could be said as being unlucky for the first convoys more than lucky for the latter group. Does it diminish their service? No. And please note, it doesn't diminish their bravery either. You don't know when you're going out to sea with your convoy whether you're going to be one of those convoys which ends up running into 3 wolf packs and just gets hammered the whole way across the North Atlantic, or whether you're going to be one of those convoys which manages to skip through in storms the whole way through and never sees a submarine. You don't know. You can't be sure either way, so it's very brave of you to go in the first place. And so, bringing that back to the Sopwith Cuckoo, single-seat torpedo bombers. 2-hour strike range, basically. Or if you consider time to form up the strike, etc., we're probably talking a strike radius from the aircraft carriers of roughly 100 miles. An hour's flight at top speed. Go in, flying for an hour on your own with a torpedo, no other defences, no other weapons. Plunge in, strike your targets, and leave. Interesting thing is, how did they think they were going to get a strike to targets? And again, that was going to involve other aircraft acting as escorts. Whilst they theoretically can navigate themselves, especially over such a shorter range, they were worried about them doing it. So they did think about having to have guidance aircraft, which would be a multi-crewed aircraft, which of course would have a navigator in it. Still, very brave crew. Very, very brave. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hopefully I didn't wander off too much at the end. I possibly did, but I had a lot of extra notes I'd added on and I didn't want to miss them out, but it's a trouble. When you have a headache and you're doing this, you tend to go even more off your notes than normally. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed. Take care.